traders and administrators in East Asia were members of a thwarted superpower that had to establish authority for their jurisdictions without continually resorting to rifles and cannons. 19th century China was so anarchistic that colonial powers such as the British could only build their compounds, police them, and use their military preeminence to commercial advantage. This was achieved through the granting of licences and monopolies over what were called farms, such as gambling or opium sales in their territories, or by imposing customs and land taxes. But they could never really convert their colonial footholds into a broader conquest. They could symbolise their legitimacy by punctuating their coastal colonies with boundary stones and garrisons. They could fill easily won treaties with territorial cessions and exclusive trade clauses. But the cut and thrust of Chinese commerce frequently spilled over British desire to regulate. For as long as the locals played this way, no East Asian colony could ever be indisputably British. The Chinese refusal to let small sovereignty losses discourage them must adversely affect how we rate British rule in China. But the British held tenaciously to the idea that law was the answer to practically every problem. Either at home or abroad, they believed it to hold an omnipotent power. We'll see that, at the height of empire, the British resorted to laws over land to gain political control of their colonies in East Asia. Several historians have observed what is termed the bluff of empire that operated in colonial possessions such as India. That is, a few thousand colonial administrators with horsehair riding crops, open-topped cars and impressive government buildings presided over 300 million subjects. Despite what the history books sometimes claim, China never fully came under the yoke of Western colonialism in this way. This was because an individual Chinese was capable of having as many masters as aliases. Chinese subjects could have interests tied up with the invader, as well as the local warlord, and for good measure sometimes called on those with imperial connections. However, the British could make their patronage conditional on the political exclusivity of a provider of a good or service. They preferred, on the whole, to censure individuals for trading with their opposite numbers, rather than put sanctions on communities or a cross-section of the nation. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, China was so lacking a central nervous system that Churchill remarked that the idea of punishing her for rebelling against Western colonial interests was like flogging a jellyfish. Nevertheless, administratively checkmating individuals in one's colony who possessed the wrong sort of political ideas was an effective and pervasive practice. In China, the British failed to transform the host community with their rules, institutions and traditions as they had done elsewhere in empire. This was because the Chinese were made impermeable by their traditions. In India, the British used a mixture of bluff, political protection rackets or divide and rule, but in China they never really tried to influence local ways across the board. Instead, the British dominated what they could, when and where they could, and the rest of the time enjoyed the country's diversions. An old hand once remarked that if India was the workplace of empire and Africa its great outdoors, then the Far East was its night off. The story of the British colonial presence in Shanghai, Weihaiwei and Hong Kong, and many other Chinese locales besides, is one of sojourning agents of empire, sinking gin par hits and sashaying with taxi girls in nightclubs called the Great World. working any harder was pointless when the ruler's job was simply to hold the local who's who and dispense favour according to clear political imperatives aimed at the colony's survival. The British of East Asia went in for a limited colonialism based on delicately administering rewards and sanctions across a network of potential suitors. Due to the cunning provided by the cadets of the Far Eastern Colonial Service, what appeared to be technical or legal decisions in British colonies were frequently none other than dressed up political ones. For example, to stop land speculation and encourage Chinese loyalty, the British administration in Hong Kong had a policy designed to encourage settled residential development of land by the Chinese upper middle class. A land purchaser had to purchase a lease and build a house on the land within 2 years in order to confirm their proprietorship of the land. If not, the owner lost their land and the British auctioned it off to somebody else. Enter Mr. Chun Tak Kwon. He was a Chinese businessman and stock trader of Hing Terrace, Hong Kong during the 1930s. He wanted a lot in Repulse Bay Road, a small one of 12,000 square feet, to go with 2 lots in the area which he'd already bought at double the upset price. That is, other people had put in for the lots, he'd shown up to the auction and outbid them. However, once he'd acquired the smaller plot, Chun changed his mind and decided to sell it quite soon after buying it at a mere $40 profit to Mr. Ko Siu Kao, to whom he was presumably newly indebted. Chun's request caused consternation to Mr. Aneurin Jones in the Land Office, who advised him that he could only sell the smaller lot if he actually built on his other 2 lots nearby, which in his situation as a debtor to Ko was presumably a steep request. Chun was speculating in the sense of him seeking to trade in land without building on it, and he wanted clearance from the Land Office to sell. The British wanted well-to-do Chinese to prove their political bona fides by staying in Hong Kong, building a house, and avoiding the transience that was associated with nationalism and those with loyalties other than to Hong Kong. Mr. Chun, by buying the extra lot and then trying to sell it quickly at next to no profit, was surmised by the Land Office to have bitten off more than he could chew. That is, he was suspected of purely profit motives rather than developmental ones, and this made him politically suspect. In Chun's case, the British were right. He was to become a notable collaborator under the Japanese. So trusted by them was he, that he had the extraordinary privilege of travelling freely to and from Canton when most locals were locked down and starving to death in Hong Kong. Whether pro-Japanese or pro-KMT, Chinese commercial adventurers were a very potent threat to the British because they could thrive in any political framework, and this undermined British colonialism itself.